In the fall of 1998, a young couple named Mark and Helen were looking for a cheap place to live outside of Richmond, Virginia. They found their answer in Amelia County, a small, secluded farmhouse on Black Hollow Road. Tucked away deep in the woods, the home was old, worn, and rather creepy. Still, the rent was low, the location remote. For a young, struggling couple, it was perfect. When they told some of their friends about their new home, they received a number of warnings. Apparently, the locals knew the home's history, and none of it good. But the couple brushed it off, thinking it just an old house with an old reputation. How old? We'll tell you shortly. The first few nights were filled with nothing but peace and quiet, which is exactly what they'd been looking for. But by the third night, they were less excited about the home's reputation. See, the night before, Helen had woken up at exactly 2:37 a.m. to what sounded like a knock on the wall. Of course, she woke Mark, who was right beside her in bed. But when he listened, he heard nothing. "Go back to sleep," he said. But it happened again that night, and the next, always at 2:37 a.m. Each time the sound seemed to come from within the walls themselves. They tried to ignore it, but it was unnerving. And if that wasn't enough, then the whispers began. Helen heard them coming down the hallway, voices too low to make out any words. Yet when she got up to investigate, the sound stopped. But then it started again. Only this time it sounded like it was coming from behind her. She ran back to Mark in their bedroom, tears streaming down her face. "I don't want to stay here," she cried. He understood. He didn't want her to be scared. So he agreed they should move. But once they looked at their lease, they realized they couldn't get out without paying a hefty fee. So they tried to push through. Helen told herself it was probably just an old house, settling, or maybe a mouse running around inside the walls. But each day her fear grew. That was until one morning when she woke up and stepped into the kitchen. She gasped. All over the kitchen floor were muddy footprints. They were clearly bare and far too small to have belonged to either Mark or herself. The tracks appeared to lead from the front door, across the kitchen, and then to a corner where they abruptly ended. What was really weird is that no doors or windows had been opened. There was no way anyone or anything could have gotten in or out. The couple checked everywhere, but found nothing else amiss. That night, their dog began barking incessantly at the exact corner where the footprints had stopped. Mark and Helen sat in the bedroom, too afraid to come out. They heard the dog growling and shaking like never before. They thought it was going to break free from its chain and run into the kitchen. But suddenly, everything went silent. The dog, the hallway, even their house. They remained like that for hours, frozen in terror, listening intently. Then slowly, cautiously, they crept out into the kitchen, but saw nothing. At that point, they decided to call a local priest. He'd heard about the home and apparently knew its history. Before he entered the house, he turned to them and said, "Whatever you do, don't open that back door." Mark and Helen agreed, but couldn't help but wonder why. The priest stepped into the house and walked straight down the hallway. Then, after a long pause, he turned and left without saying a word. They asked him what was wrong, but he wouldn't say. In fact, he refused to enter the house again. Mark and Helen were left confused, frightened, but perhaps most of all disappointed. They thought the priest would bless the home, rid it of whatever evil may dwell within. Now, not only did they feel helpless against the entity haunting their home, but they had no answers. They tried to carry on, but it was difficult. Helen couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was always watching her, that they were being stalked. Her anxiety built. The whispers in the hallway grew louder, the footsteps more frequent. And then, as if it weren't enough, Helen began experiencing sleepwalking episodes. She never remembered these incidents, but Mark would often wake up in the night to find her missing. He'd go out looking for her and would find his wife standing in the dark woods surrounding their home, lost in a trance-like state. Sometimes he would hear her speaking, but in a voice that wasn't hers, saying things that made no sense. One night, Mark got up to use the bathroom. As he walked past his wife's sleeping form, he swore he heard her whisper, "He's in the walls. He wants her back." Mark didn't know what to make of it, but couldn't shake the feeling that the home's previous owner was somehow involved. To find out if he was right, he did some research. He learned that the home had originally belonged to a man named Thomas Jefferson Hill. In 1912, he and his wife had lived in the house with their 7-year-old daughter, Mary. The family was well-liked in town. Thomas worked as a school teacher and Mary as a seamstress. They were active members of the community and generally happy. But then, without warning, tragedy struck. Mary fell ill and soon died. Her parents grieved for their only child, but slowly began to recover. Then, 1 year later, both Thomas and his wife passed away as well. Their deaths were sudden and unexpected, leaving the home abandoned. Mark felt like he finally had an answer, that the ghost of Mary Hill was haunting their home. But then he read the news clippings detailing the family's deaths. The Hills hadn't died in their home. In fact, they died at separate locations due to separate causes. Thomas had suffered a fatal heart attack while visiting relatives in St. Louis. His wife had died in their home, but only from a self-administered morphine overdose. She had no apparent pain or illness, leading many to believe she simply took her own life. And what was the cause of that? Well, the only thing they could think of was Mary's death the previous year. But that was just a theory. Nothing concrete ever surfaced, and so the mystery remained. Was the house haunted by the ghosts of Mary, her mother, or even her father? Or was something more sinister lurking within those four walls? Sadly, we may never know. That brings us back to Mark and Helen. Armed with the knowledge of the home's tragic history, Mark decided to set up a camera in the hallway. This was the spot where Helen had heard the whispers and where he'd found the strange footprints. He set up the camera, hid in the bedroom, and waited. Just before 2:37 a.m., he heard a knock. The camera rolled. At first, the footage showed nothing, but as it continued, a pale figure emerged from the shadows. The figure was hunched over, almost like an old woman. She wore what appeared to be a tattered white dress and seemed to be floating rather than walking. What made the image even more horrifying is that she had no face, no eyes. Mark watched as the figure floated down the hallway and stopped. It turned its head and stared directly into the camera lens. Then it vanished. Things rapidly went downhill from there. Helen became increasingly terrified. She refused to spend another night in the house. They packed their things and fled in the middle of the night. They didn't even stop to get their cat, which they eventually had to leave behind. Today the house remains vacant, mostly because no one can stay there longer than a week. And every night at exactly 2:37 a.m., something knocks. Now, what do you think is haunting the farmhouse on Black Hollow Road? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that subscribe button to join us for more terrifying tales.